Violet and Xander walked slowly down the stairs together as their mother, Ursula, called. There in the hall, with a suitcase, stood a man whom they both could not stand. "Violet, Xander, welcome David," Ursula said excitedly. "As I already said, now he will be part of our family." "Mom," Violet replied contemptuously, "you haven't even finished divorcing Dad yet." "Well, fortunately, I'll get a divorce soon," her mother answered firmly, dissatisfied that the children did not share her excitement. "Don't you think it's a little inappropriate?" Violet Ursula shouted angrily at her daughter. "This is his car." Xander asked dismissively, looking at the familiar car parked in the driveway. "I thought you said this guy was successful. Dad bought himself a Mercedes SUV, the best in its class. It's pretty cool." "It's good to see you kids again," David said somewhat awkwardly after Xander's not-so-kind comparison to his father. "Yes, I'm also going to change the car. I'm expecting a promotion, so we'll have that opportunity soon." Neither Violet nor Xander looked impressed. A tense silence hung in the air. "Welcome, David, to our home," Ursula hissed at her children, outraged by their rudeness. "Yes, as you say," Violet said uncannily, going upstairs. "They just need to get used to it a little," Ursula reassured the upset David. Violet, 16, and Xander, 12, had learned of their parents' divorce 6 months earlier when they were informed of their mother's infidelity. This happened after 2 years of watching their parents fight. Their mother's coldness towards their father, Gary, her swearing at him. She used any excuse to be away for days at a time, regular weekends and holidays with her friends, trips to see family, and the like. It got to the point that even the children did not believe their mother. It pained them to see their father lose his self-respect while desperately trying to save his marriage. Their parents sought marriage counseling, but David was always lurking in the background. When Ursula was not at home, they heard their father crying at night. After 2 years, Gary finally broke down. He found evidence of her affair before filing for divorce and blamed David. Both parents sat down with their children to explain why they were separating. Xander began to cry, and Violet stared at her mother with poorly concealed hostility. Ursula refused to look the children in the eyes, feeling awkward. She tried to give her husband equal responsibility, but it didn't work because no one believed her. All she could offer was that she had fallen in love with someone else. What followed was an agonizing 3 months as Gary looked for a place to stay. Ursula was relieved when he moved out. It didn't really make life at home any more enjoyable. Both Violet and Xander were very angry with their mother, who was too distracted by David to notice. Once the divorce proceedings began after Gary moved out, it became bittersweet as the love between Gary and Ursula was completely lost. Gary sued for full custody of the children and home. Ursula resisted and demanded increased child support, a house for which Gary had to pay the mortgage, and the ability to control the father's visits with the children. It took 6 months for the divorce to be finalized. What the imperturbable judge ruled was unsatisfactory for everyone. Gary had to pay his half of the mortgage until Ursula remarried, if she ever did, as well as child support. Guardianship was complicated by the difference in the children's ages. Violet was considered old enough to choose which parent to live with, but Xander was not. It was decided that Xander would stay at the family home with Ursula during the week and spend the weekends with his father. Violet reluctantly decided to do the same for her brother's sake. She burst into tears in her father's arms when she told him about it. Gary also tearfully told his daughter that he was proud of her for caring for her brother. Their parents' divorce brought Violet and Xander closer, especially since Violet was forced to deal with her brother while her mother continued her affair with David. A month after the divorce, Ursula invited Violet and Xander to dinner to meet David for the first time. It didn't take long for the kids to figure out who David was. "Violet, Xander, this is David, the man I'm dating," Ursula said proudly, squeezing David's hand. "You mean this is the guy you cheated on Dad with?" Violet grinned. Xander slouched in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and turned away sullenly. "Violet," Ursula snapped, looking around to see if anyone had heard her daughter's words. "It's okay, Ursula." David smiled embarrassedly, although he didn't like Violet's contemptuous directness. I wish your mother and I had met under different circumstances, but as you get older, you will realize that love doesn't always work out the way you want it to. Yes, Dad learned that the hard way, Violet replied. Anger flashed across David's face, and Ursula tried her best to contain her rage. Xander, I hear you're a good baseball player, David said cheerfully to Xander, trying to change the subject. Yeah, I'm fine, Xander answered sullenly without looking at David. Maybe you and I could play, David suggested, smiling. Ursula happily agreed. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it, Xander? Nope, was all Xander said. David and Ursula's smiles faded. The atmosphere at the table became tense due to Violet's hostility, Xander's sullenness, David's disappointment, and Ursula's hidden anger. The meal was eaten in silence, and dessert was refused by both children, who were impatient to leave. That was extremely rude of you, Ursula said angrily to the children, driving them home. David tried very hard to get to know you better, and you publicly disrespected him. I don't like him, Xander said from the backseat. I can't believe you left Dad for him, Violet added. Dad is much better in every way. Ursula wiped away a tear and began to look clearly upset. If you just give him a chance, you will love him as much as I do. He is such an amazing person. Neither Violet nor Xander said anything. Returning home, Violet and Xander immediately went to their rooms, leaving their mother to tearfully call David and apologize for the children. Dad, you shouldn't leave it like this. Violet screamed at her father in frustration when she told him about her meeting with David. You have to tell Mom that we don't want to know him. No, I'm not happy about it either, Gary replied irritably, before switching to a calmer tone to reassure his daughter. But this day had to come. There's nothing I can do about it unless he hurts you. I think you will have to see him much more often. Unfortunately, this is up to your mother to decide. Gary's intuition was correct. Ursula convinced herself that the more Violet and Xander got to know David, the sooner they would fall in love with him. It is obvious. David is a wonderful person, and the kids will understand that. David began coming for dinner and staying overnight. Despite his best efforts, communication was minimal. He bought gifts that were carelessly thrown away after David left. Ursula found them in the trash, in boxes, unopened. Ursula even invited David and his parents to visit, calling them Violet and Xander's step-grandparents. Much to her disappointment and the confusion of David's parents, Violet and Xander still refused to communicate. Violet, Xander, I need to talk to you, Ursula said firmly. Everything was boiling inside her. Their behavior was abnormal. She tried very hard to involve David in the children's lives, but they constantly refused. She was convinced that Gary encouraged them to behave this way. I need to understand why you behave this way towards David. He's been kind to you, but neither of you gives him a chance. Why? Does your father order you to do this? Dad told us it was your problem, not his. He doesn't want to know, Violet retorted. Anyway, we don't like David because of what he did to Dad. I can't believe you're forcing this on us. Violet said what Ursula was afraid of. No one is forcing you to do anything. David is going to be part of our family. I just want you to accept it. Let him make you as happy as he makes me, she said almost pleadingly. That's exactly what it sounds like. You're forcing it on us. And you, Xander? What can you say? You don't like David either, Ursula asked reproachfully. Xander simply shook his head slowly in disgust. I just don't want to know him. Ursula could not understand the children. Why did they behave this way? She felt irritated and frustrated. Because of this, her sex life with David suffered. They only had the opportunity to enjoy sex on the weekends when Violet and Xander were at their father's. Things seemed to be much better when she was still married and secretly dating David. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Gary was behind it all. After talking with the kids, she made sure Gary could see David whenever he picked up or dropped off the kids. She wanted him to see that she, David, and the children were a happy family, and that he could not come between them. At first, she was pleased to note that meeting David was stressful for Gary, but then he began to seem happier and more relaxed. Out of spite, she tried to send David to Gary to pick up the children, But the children refused to get into David's car. Gary drove them home. All Ursula could hope for was for David to move in with them. He was much more reluctant than she expected. Despite the problems with the children, she thought everything was fine between them. So here they were, David standing at the front door with his suitcase and belongings in his drag car, being insulted by Violet and Xander once again, while Ursula comforted him. If Ursula thought that David moving in with them would make Violet and Xander accept him, then she was sorely mistaken. The already tense situation in the house worsened even more. Violet and Xander refused to communicate with David. Mealtimes passed in silence. When David tried to talk to them, Violet and Xander waited in silence until he fell silent. Offers to play with Xander were rejected, and offers to teach Violet to drive were met with a sharp, "Daddy's teaching me." Any attempts to integrate David into the family were simply ignored. When Violet and Xander were forced to interact as a family with David involved, nothing good worked out. It wasn't long before David started complaining and suggesting that Violet and Xander spend more time with their father. A furious Ursula confronted Gary as he was picking up the children from his former home. "Gary, you need to talk to the kids about how they behave with David," she told him angrily. "Stop turning them against him." "And what do you want me to do?" Gary shrugged. "You brought this asshole into their lives, not me." "I know it's your job. You need to stop or I'll go to court and cut off all access to Xander and Violet." "You're delusional." Gary laughed incredulously. "You cheated on me with him, and then you complained that they don't accept your asshole lover. Perhaps a relationship born of infidelity wasn't such a good idea after all. Violet and Xander are good children and know the difference between right and wrong. They can form their own opinion. They don't need me to tell them anything. They are old enough to decide for themselves. What happens between them and David is not my problem." Ursula glared at her ex-husband and rushed back into the house. The attempt to arrange a vacation was only successful because Violet and Xander left, leaving Ursula and David alone. This gave a boost to their flagging relationship. Gary's indifference to David and Ursula's relationship soon became apparent. During dinner, after Gary dropped the kids off, Violet and Xander started talking excitedly about Kalia, Gary's new girlfriend. She came to Gary unannounced when Gary was away for work and the children were home alone. The unexpected meeting went surprisingly well. Worried, Gary rushed over to see his children and girlfriend talking. After answering a few awkward questions and reassuring Gary that Callie already knew about them, how his marriage ended, and that Callie made him happy, the kids hugged her. Ursula was ready to scream in anger as she listened to this. They barely said David's name after nearly 6 months of trying. But after one unplanned meeting, the kids welcomed their dad's new girlfriend with open arms. Despite all the problems, Ursula was determined to prove that her relationship with David was a success. Her social media use has increased dramatically. She posted photos of her and David hugging and smiling, telling the world how lucky she was. There were photographs of children too, photos of David at kids' events, Xander's baseball games, and Violet's soccer games. She desperately tried to portray David as a loving stepfather. Xander's birthday became a point of contention. She spent his birthday at their home and put a lot of effort and expense into it. Not only Xander's friends were invited, but also their parents and brothers and sisters. Ursula also invited David's family and began calling David's nephews Xander and Violet's cousins. Much to Ursula's disappointment, Xander insisted that Gary be invited too, and Gary insisted that cousins. Xander had a great time. So did Violet, who knew many of Xander's friends' older siblings. The problem was Gary. Ursula was happy to introduce David to the parents of all of Xander's friends, but Gary had known them for a long time, and they were all eager to know how Gary was doing. David became more and more relegated to the background in his own home. Ursula's children treated David's entire family coldly. Xander completely ignored David and refused to take a photo with him. Xander interacted with his father a lot, and those at the party began to notice this. In Ursula's opinion, Gary was ruining the party she had so carefully organized. But then David did the most amazing thing. He got down on one knee and proposed to Ursula with a ring she had no idea she was buying. Surprised, Ursula could not believe it and began to cry with happiness. This proposal received applause. She was sure of it. It truly was the happiest day of her life. She insisted that the four of them take a photo. If there were any negative comments, she didn't hear them. She, David, Violet, and Xander were going to officially become a family. If Violet and Xander were unhappy about Ursula's upcoming wedding to David, they didn't show it. It seemed like the best move David could have made. Their attitude towards David changed. They began to communicate with him, walk alone with him, and even smile in his presence. The tense atmosphere of recent months has dissipated. Ursula felt like they were the family she had dreamed of since she first met David. In her delirium, Ursula saw no reason to postpone the wedding. It was planned for the start of the school summer holidays, so Gary could pick up the children while he and David went on their honeymoon. She wanted to get married as soon as the divorce was finalized. The only thing that took the wind out of her sails was Gary's lack of interest. All she got from him was an emotionless congratulations and a shrug. He really was worthless. Divorcing him was the best decision she ever made. Everything leading up to the wedding was perfect. The preparations went smoothly. All invited guests were accepted. The wedding day turned out to be sunny and warm. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, changes occurred in the children. Ursula couldn't understand what was going on. There seemed to be a nervous excitement in them. It was as if they couldn't wait for something to happen. She assumed it was because of the wedding and the fast approaching school holidays. This made sense. The wedding was grand, and the children had an important role to play. Ursula wanted her father to walk her down the aisle, but although her parents were present at the ceremony, they did not like David. Well, then Xander will walk her down the aisle, and Violet should be the bridesmaid. Ursula loved going wedding dress shopping with Violet. Xander seemed happy to shop for a wedding suit with David. The wedding will take place at a nearby resort overlooking the lake. The grounds were beautiful and perfect for photos. Ursula was more excited than she had ever been in her life. During the wedding rehearsal, Ursula noticed that Violet and Xander were constantly whispering and laughing together, which made the entire rehearsal difficult. She got the impression that they were up to something. Ursula felt her anger rising, but in David they had an unexpected protector. Relax, they are just children. They're probably just excited or nervous, he told her. David was right, of course. Violet and Xander had now fully accepted him, so why would they behave badly? The wedding day started off great. Ursula and Violet went to get their hair, nails, and makeup done. Mother and daughter together, they looked great. The provisions were delivered on time, as were the flowers. Right before the ceremony, everything went wrong. Xander had gone missing. Violet went to look for her brother and did not return. Ursula paced in front of the hotel's small chapel. All the guests were inside and waiting. David was waiting. Where were the children? She couldn't get married without them. 15 minutes later, the children finally appeared. An irritated Ursula said, "Okay, Violet, let's go." Violet opened the chapel door and led her mother and brother down the aisle. In her tension, Ursula didn't notice that Violet and Xander weren't smiling. Once Ursula reached the end of the aisle, she smiled at David with a happy and excited smile, mouthing hello to him. She kissed both children who sat in front. The brother and sister began whispering to each other until the officiant cleared his throat and gave them a stern look that made everyone in the chapel laugh. The master of ceremonies began the wedding ceremony. He talked about how radiant Ursula looked. What a happy day it was for Ursula and David, and how lucky Violet and Xander were to have David join their family. Both Ursula and David smiled at Violet and Xander at his words. The children smiled sweetly in response. Then the friends stood up and started talking about what a wonderful couple Ursula and David were and how perfect they were for each other. Any stress Ursula had felt faded as she was consumed by happiness. Before the vows were taken, the master of ceremonies announced, "Now, by state law, I am required to ask if anyone objects to the union of Ursula and David." Silence reigned. There were one or two nervous chuckles. But then Violet and Xander jumped out of their seats and shouted in unison, "We object." Ursula turned around sharply and looked at the children in horror. The master of ceremonies almost took a step back in surprise, and the guests gasped loudly several times. David simply stared straight ahead, slowly shaking his head and laughing in disbelief. "Violet, Xander, what are you doing? It's not funny." Ursula's eyes filled with tears. She did not believe what her children did on the happiest day of her life. Violet stood up for Xander, explaining her objection to the guests. "Most of you are probably wondering why Mom and David are getting married so soon, and why they moved in with each other so quickly after she and Dad split up. The truth is that they dated for almost 2 years, although Mom was married to Dad. They are cheaters. Mom cheated on Dad with David. David, is this true?" David's parents asked offendedly. David didn't answer or even turn around. Dissatisfied muttering was heard around. "Quiet," Ursula hissed at Violet, panic beginning to take over her. It was turning into a nightmare. Most of the guests had no idea about this. Neither she nor David tried not to show off their infidelities. "We hate David. He's the reason our parents split up," Xander continued. "Our dad cried all the time because Mom was with David. We had to live with them while Mom dated David, and then Mom forced him on us. We don't want David to marry his mom. We don't want David to be our stepfather. We don't want to live with David, and we don't want to know David at all. Mom, if you marry David, we will live with Dad." Violet almost growled at her mother. "Violet, what are you talking about? Please don't do this," Ursula begged her children. Turning to David, she pleaded, "Give me a minute. I'll talk to them and put an end to this." David shook his head and said almost calmly to his bride, "No, I'm over it. I'm not going to live the rest of my life being bullied every day by these little assholes. They don't like me and they never will, and you know what? I don't like them either. I spent too much time and a lot of money on them, and all I got was disrespect. I will marry you only if you live with me, but not with them." Ursula fell silent and looked at David in a way that made it clear that she would never be able to do what he was talking about. "I thought so." David headed towards the exit. Ursula desperately grabbed his hand. "David, we can fix this." No, we can't. Because there's nothing to fix. This is simply the reality of the situation." David left the chapel. Ursula burst into tears. Black streaks stained her face with running mascara. She froze, seeing her fiancé leaving her life. Why did you do this to me?" she asked her children inconsolably. "We hate you for what you did to Dad," Xander replied coldly. "You made us live with the guy you cheated on Dad with." "Who does this?" Violet asked, looking furious. "You turned Dad's life and our lives into a nightmare." Ursula seemed to be pierced by clarity. The whole time she was with David, she never thought about how it would affect the children. She was sure they would love David, but they never did and never would have done it. She had forever ruined her relationship with the two people she loved most in the world, and they might never love her again. Ursula just stared at the children and collapsed on the floor, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never imagined you would feel this way. I never thought this would happen. I love you. Please, I love you," she said, stretching out her hands pleadingly in the empty chapel. Violet and Xander did not approach their mother. Their brows furrowed and they also looked upset. Their plot achieved what they wanted, but little did they expect that they would turn their mother into a pitiful and broken figure prostrate before them. "Violet, do you have a phone?" Grandma, Ursula's mother, asked softly. Violet nodded and opened her purse to show her grandmother. "You and Xander go back to your rooms and change clothes. Call your dad to come pick you up. You'll have to stay with him for a while." "But how is Mom?" Violet asked worriedly. "Don't worry about your mother. We'll take care of her. I'll call your father tonight and explain what happened. You will be able to see your mother in a few days when she has calmed down," Ursula's father assured her. Ursula's father carefully helped his daughter up from the floor and led her out of the chapel. All the way she looked back at her children, who stood somewhat stunned. The grandmother hugged the children. "There is no need to apologize. Your grandfather and I never liked David or what your mother did to Gary either. The consequences of all this are now being realized, and it will greatly affect her. In the long run, it will be for the better. But right now, things are tough. She needs to earn your forgiveness, and she needs to understand that she forced you to do this. She will have to establish a new cordial relationship with Gary and learn to respect him again as the father of her children. She did a terrible thing. I doubt he'll ever be able to forgive her. Ursula has a lot of self-healing and learning to do. This can take years of therapy. I love you, Violet. I love you, Xander. Do not worry. Everything will be okay. Grandpa and I will always be by your side. Now let's go home. The grandmother comforted them. The children and their grandmother left the scene of the brutal massacre of their mother without even looking back. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.